All right, buckle up for a deep dive, folks. We're taking a look at the MAHA Commission today.
MAHA, huh?
Yeah, and things could get interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
So we're digging into this article. It's called Episode 153, MAHA's Looters.pdf.
Looters. Sounds intense.
Yeah, they don't hold back. See, MAHA's whole thing is making America healthy again, right?
Right.
Well, this article claims it's not about public health at all.
Oh, what do they think is really going on then?
Basically, they say it's a power grab.
A power grab. By who?
Corporations, mainly, they say MAHA is setting the stage to hand over a big chunk of healthcare to private companies.
That's a bold claim.
It is, and the person they've put in charge of this whole thing is, well, an interesting choice.
Who is it?
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Oh, wow. Okay. I know that name, but not really in the context of healthcare.
Right. He's been a major figure in the anti-vaccine movement, so having him lead a commission focused on health, it definitely raises some eyebrows.
Yeah, if the guy in charge is questioning widely accepted science, it makes you wonder what their real agenda is.
Exactly. So that's where this article comes in. They call it MAHA a neoliberal project.
Neoliberal. That gets thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean in this context?
Well, think about things like charter schools replacing public schools, or private healthcare becoming more and more common.
Okay, I see. So the idea is that private companies can do things better than the government, and they should be in charge.
Right. And this article says MAHA is part of that bigger trend pushing to give private companies more control over healthcare.
How would they even do that?
One way, the article suggests, is by framing health as a purely personal choice, downplaying the role of things like poverty, pollution, the cost of healthcare itself. You know, it's like saying, if you're not healthy, it's your fault. But wait, isn't there some truth to personal responsibility? We all make choices about what we eat and how much we exercise.
Absolutely there is. But this article is saying MAHA might take it too far. Like if you overemphasize personal choice, then it becomes easier to justify cutting public health programs.
I see. It's like saying, well, if it's all up to the individual, why do we need government-funded healthcare? Or healthy school lunches? Or, clean air and water?
Exactly.
So basically, they shift the blame onto individuals to dismantle public health care, make it more of a pay-to-play system.
Right. And to make it sound more appealing, they'll use slick language buzzwords like choice and innovation.
Oh, yeah, everyone loves more options, right?
Right. But the article is saying we need to be careful because those buzzwords can be a smokescreen for handing over control to private companies. And those companies, their main goal is profit, not necessarily your health.
So it's like, sure, you have more choices if you can afford them.
Exactly. And this isn't just some American thing either.
Oh.
This article draws parallels to what's been happening in other countries, especially developing nations. They call it neocolonialism.
Neocolonialism, that sounds intense.
It is. It basically means wealthy countries or corporations exploiting resources and people in poorer countries for their own gain.
Okay, so they're saying MAHA could bring those same tactics home to America, using healthcare to, extract wealth from everyday people.
That's the argument. And it's not just theoretical. The article points to real-world examples where deregulation and privatization have led to things like environmental damage and exploitation of workers. They're saying MAHA could be a step in that direction for American healthcare.
Wow, that's a pretty heavy accusation to make. So they're saying this permission wants to shift healthcare from a public good to something corporations can profit from, even if it means people suffer.
Yeah, that's their take. And they're particularly worried about the impact on certain groups, the most vulnerable ones.
Like who?
They specifically mention disabled and trans individuals.
Okay, but how would this commission affect them?
Well, they talk about this protect the children rhetoric that's often used to justify policies that actually end up harming kids, especially those who are already marginalized.
Oh yeah, I've seen that playbook before. Sounds all nice and caring, but it's often used to push agendas that don't actually benefit kids at all.
Exactly. And in this case, the article suggests that this rhetoric could be used to restrict access to gender-affirming care for trans youth or to defund disability accommodation in schools.
So it's like they're using concern for children as a weapon to push through policies that could actually make their lives worse.
Right. And when you're talking about people who are already facing so many barriers and so much discrimination, these policies could be devastating.
This is getting pretty intense. It sounds like this MAHA Commission is more than just a healthcare policy group. It's like they're trying to reshape how we think about health and who's responsible for it.
You got it. And the article is urging people to wake up and pay attention because the stakes are incredibly high.
Okay, so we've got this commission, potentially problematic leadership, this theory about them wanting to shift power to private companies, and worries about how it could hurt everyday people. But is everyone on this commission the same? I mean, are they all like Kennedy?
That's a good question. The article actually does a pretty deep dive into the backgrounds of the other commission members. And, well, let's just say it's not exactly a diverse group.
What do you mean?
A lot of familiar faces from the Republican Party and conservative think tanks.
So it's leaning heavily towards one side of the political spectrum?
You could say that. They specifically mentioned Vince Haley. He's a longtime Republican strategist. And Brooke Rollins, she used to run the Texas Public Policy Foundation. That's a think tank known for pushing free market policies.
Okay, so we're seeing a pattern here. But what does that actually mean for the commission's work?
Well, if you look at the organizations these people are connected to, there's a pretty clear agenda. Limited government, deregulation, and a strong belief that the private sector can solve most problems.
So it's not just about healthcare, it's about a whole way of thinking about how society should function.
Exactly. And the article is suggesting that this commission could be a way to put that worldview into action, using healthcare as a starting point.
Okay, so we're talking about a shift away from the government and towards corporations. But is that really such a bad thing? I mean, a lot of people say businesses are more efficient than government agencies.
That's a common argument. But this article raises some serious concerns about what happens when you apply that logic to essential services like healthcare.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, when profit is the main motivator, things like access and affordability can take a back seat.
So basically, if you can't pay, you don't get care.
It's not quite that simple, but it gets to the heart of the issue. When profit is the driving force in healthcare, it creates a system where the most vulnerable people often suffer the most.
That makes sense, but couldn't you argue that competition between private companies would actually drive down costs and improve quality?
In theory, yes. But in practice, the article argues it doesn't always work out that way. Healthcare is incredibly complex. It's not always easy to compare different providers or treatments.
So it's not like shopping for a TV or a car where you can easily see the differences.
Right. And when people are sick or injured, they're not always in a position to make rational, informed decisions about their care.
I see what you mean. So they're saying the free market doesn't always work so well when it comes to something as essential as healthcare.
Exactly. And they're not alone in that view. There's a lot of research and evidence suggesting that a purely market-based approach to healthcare can actually lead to inequality, higher costs, and worse outcomes for a lot of people.
Okay, so this commission might be pushing for a more market-driven healthcare system, but this article is saying, hold on, that might not be such a good thing.
Right. And there's another player in all of this that the article highlights,
Who's that?
a think tank called the Heritage Foundation.
Ah, I've heard of them. They're pretty conservative, right?
Very much so. They've been a major force behind a lot of Republican policies for decades. They advocate for things like free markets, limited government, and reduced social spending.
And why is that relevant to this MAHA commission?
Because, as the article points out, several members of the commission have close ties to the Heritage Foundation.
Oh, really? Like who?
Well, there's Russell Vought. He was a high-ranking official in the Trump administration. And he's also a former vice president of Heritage Action for America, which is basically the lobbying arm of the Heritage Foundation.
So they're saying the Heritage Foundation could be using the MAHA commission to push their own agenda.
That's the concern. And if you look at the Heritage Foundation's history, they've consistently favored policies that benefit corporations and wealthy individuals, often at the expense of social programs and those safety nets that are designed to help people who are struggling.
Okay, so we've got a commission that's leaning heavily towards one side of the political spectrum, and they might be influenced by a think tank with a very specific agenda. That's not exactly reassuring. What about the other side, though? What do Democrats think about all of this?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. This article is actually pretty critical of the Democratic Party as well.
Really? I would have thought they'd be opposed to all this privatization talk.
You'd think so, right? And they might make some noise about it, but the article argues that they don't actually have the will or the power to effectively challenge this whole neoliberal push.
So it's not just about Republicans versus Democrats. It's about something bigger than that, something that goes beyond those traditional party lines.
Exactly. The article is suggesting that both parties, to some extent, are beholden to corporate interests, and that this undermines their ability to truly represent the needs of everyday people.
It's a pretty cynical view of the political landscape, but I can see where they're coming from.
Right. And it's a view that challenges us to look beyond the usual left-right arguments and see those deeper forces that are shaping our political system.
So it's not enough to just pick a side and cheer for your team. It's about demanding more from our elected officials, holding them accountable regardless of which party they belong to.
Absolutely. And it's about understanding that real change requires solutions that address the root causes of these problems, not just Band-Aid fixes that tweak the existing system.
That makes sense. But even if we acknowledge that both parties are part of the problem, what can we actually do about it?
Well, that's where the article gets really interesting. They propose a pretty radical solution.
Okay, I'm listening. What is it?
They say we need to reject the entire neoliberal framework.
Whoa. Hold on, isn't that a bit extreme?
Yeah, it might sound extreme, but the article makes a compelling case. They argue that this whole neoliberal model is inherently flawed. It prioritizes profit over people, and it inevitably leads to inequality and injustice.
So they're saying we need a completely different way of thinking about how society works.
Exactly. They're calling for a paradigm shift, a move away from market-driven solutions and towards a system that puts human needs and well-being first.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but I'm also a little skeptical. Is that even possible? I mean, we've been living under this neoliberal model for so long, it's hard to imagine anything different.
I get it, it's hard to wrap your head around such a big change. But the article points to historical examples of social movements that have successfully challenged the status quo and created more just and equitable societies.
So they're saying we need to build a new movement for change, a movement that rejects the whole neoliberal framework and demands something better.
That's right. And they're not just talking about abstract ideals, they're talking about concrete policy changes, like universal health care, affordable housing, a living wage.
Okay, that's big picture stuff, but it's also kind of inspiring. It's like they're saying we have the power to create a better world, but we have to be willing to fight for it.
Exactly. The article is a call to action, a challenge to think critically about the forces that are shaping our world and to resist those that prioritize profit over people.
All right, so we've got a good understanding of this article's overall critique of the MAHA Commission and this whole neoliberal agenda. But let's get into the nitty-gritty. How do they say this commission is actually going to achieve its goals? What are the tactics?
Good question. The article outlines a few key strategies that they think this commission might use. And one of the most, well, insidious is framing health as a personal choice.
Okay, we talked about that a bit earlier, but let's dig a little deeper. Why is that framing so dangerous?
Because it shifts the blame away from corporations and the government and puts it squarely on the individual. It's like saying, look, if you're not healthy, it's your own fault. You made bad choices.
Right, and we talked about how that can be used to justify cutting public health programs, but what are some of the other tactics the article mentions?
Well, they also warn about the use of certain buzzwords like choice and innovation to justify the privatization of public health services.
Ah, yes, the language of reform. Sounds so appealing, but as we've been discussing, it can often hide a much less appealing agenda.
Exactly. And in this case, the article suggests that the real goal of this reform might be to funnel public resources to private companies, even if it means that people lose access to essential services.
So it's like using language to trick people into supporting policies that could actually harm them.
That's the concern. The article is really urging people to be wary of this kind of rhetoric and to look beyond the surface to understand the real implications of these policy decisions.
Okay, so framing health as a personal choice, using buzzwords to disguise privatization. What else?
Well, they also point to something that's been happening more and more in recent years, increased surveillance of people's health choices.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about this, like using data from fitness trackers and health apps to monitor what people are doing.
That's one example. But it can also involve collecting genetic information, monitoring social media activity, even tracking people's movements using GPS data.
That sounds incredibly invasive.
It can be. And the article raises concerns about how this kind of data could be used to discriminate against people, especially those with pre-existing conditions or those who engage in behaviors that are considered unhealthy.
So it's like Big Brother meets healthcare.
That's a good way to put it. And the article is saying that the MAHA Commission could be used to expand these kinds of surveillance programs and to normalize this intrusive data collection.
Okay, so we've got a lot to be worried about here. Framing health as a personal choice, using buzzwords to disguise privatization, increasing surveillance. It's a pretty grim picture.
It is. But remember, the goal of this article isn't to scare people. It's to inform and to empower.
But what can we do? What's the takeaway message here?
The takeaway is that we need to be aware of the potential consequences of these tactics and resist efforts to take away our privacy, our autonomy, and our access to essential services.
That's a big task. Where do we even begin?
The article offers a few suggestions. First, we need to educate ourselves about these issues and the forces at play.
So reading articles like this is a good start.
Definitely. The more we understand about how this neoliberal agenda works, the better equipped we are to challenge it.
Okay, what else?
We can support organizations that are fighting for social justice and economic equality.
Like groups that advocate for universal health care, affordable housing, things like that.
Exactly. Those organizations are on the front lines, and they need our support.
What else can we do?
We can contact our elected officials and make it clear that we oppose policies that put profit over people.
Okay, so calling, emailing, writing letters, all that stuff.
It all makes a difference. Our elected officials need to know that we're paying attention and that we hold them accountable.
Okay, I'm starting to feel a little more empowered. But these problems seem so huge. It's hard to believe that anything we do can really make a difference.
I know what you mean. It's easy to feel overwhelmed. But this article reminds us that change is possible. Throughout history, social movements have challenged the status quo and created more just and equitable societies.
So we need to think big, act boldly, and never give up hope.
Exactly. The future isn't set in stone. We have the power to shape it, but only if we're willing to fight for what we believe in.
That's a powerful message. And it's a good reminder that even though this deep dive has been pretty heavy, it's not about despair. It's about understanding the challenges we face and then taking action to create a better world.
You got it. Knowledge is power. The more we understand the forces that are shaping our world, the better equipped we are to challenge them and create positive change.
All right, so we've covered a lot of grounding. The MAHA Commission, this whole idea of neoliberalism, the tactics that are being used to undermine public health and social welfare. But before we move on, I want to talk about something that might be on your mind. The article's predictions about what could actually happen if the MAHA Commission gets its way.
Yeah, I think that's something to address. This article lays out some pretty dire predictions.
So it's not just about understanding the tactics, it's also about facing the potential consequences if we don't act.
Exactly. This article is a warning, it's a call to action, and it's a reminder that the stakes are incredibly high.
Okay, well, on that note, I think it's time for a quick breather. When we come back, we'll dig into the article's specific predictions about what could happen if the MAHA Commission's vision for American healthcare becomes reality.
So we left off talking about this article's predictions, right?
Yeah, and they don't exactly paint a rosy picture.
Not at all. It's like they took everything we've been discussing, all those tactics and concerns, and then projected them forward to see where they could lead.
And where do they say we could end up?
Well, the first thing they highlight is a major shift towards privatization.
Privatization, huh? So basically, less government, more private companies running the show.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. They're talking about taking things that are currently public resources, things we all fund through our taxes, and handing them over to private companies.
Okay, but how would that actually work? Can you give me an example?
Sure. Think about Medicaid. Right now, it's a government-funded program, helps millions of low-income Americans access health care, right? Well, the article suggests that MAHA could push to privatize parts of Medicaid, hand it over to private insurance companies.
So instead of the government managing it, you'd have these private companies in charge with a profit motive baked in.
Exactly. And that raises some real concerns about whether people would actually get the care they need. I mean, these companies would be driven by their bottom line, right? They'd be looking to cut costs and limit services.
Yeah, I can see how that could be a problem. It's like if you're a company and your main goal is making money, your focus shifts from providing quality care to, well, making as much profit as possible.
Right. And the people who would likely suffer the most are those who are already struggling, those who rely on those public programs for essential services.
That's a scary thought. It's like taking something that's supposed to be a safety net, a way to ensure that everyone has access to basic necessities, and turning it into just another business opportunity.
That's a good way to put it. And it's not just Medicaid they're worried about. The article suggests that other public services could be targeted too, things like school nutrition programs. Basically anything that's currently considered a public good, something that's essential for everyone's well-being, could be on the chopping block.
So essentially, they're talking about shrinking the role of government in healthcare and expanding the role of private companies. But wouldn't that just create more competition? And wouldn't that, in theory, lead to better services and lower prices?
That's the argument you often hear from proponents of privatization. But the article pushes back on that, suggesting that it's not so simple.
Why not?
Well, for one thing, healthcare isn't like other industries. It's incredibly complex. It's not always easy to compare different providers or treatments. And when people are sick or injured, they're not always in a position to make rational, informed decisions about their care.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's not like shopping for a car or a TV where you can easily compare features and prices.
Exactly. And when you add in the profit motive, things get even more complicated. Companies are going to be looking for ways to cut cost and increase their revenue. And that can sometimes come at the expense of quality care.
So it's like this tension between the need to provide care and the need to make a profit. And those two things don't always align.
Right. And the article is basically saying that when it comes to essential services like healthcare, we shouldn't be putting profit first. We need to prioritize people's well-being.
So privatization is one big prediction. What else do they say could happen?
Well, they also talk about corporate subsidies, basically the government giving money to private healthcare companies, even though those companies are already profitable.
Wait, so using taxpayer money to prop up private companies?
Exactly, and it's often justified with talk about promoting innovation and competition, but the article argues that it's really just a way to funnel money to the wealthy and powerful.
And that money could be used to fund, actual public health care programs, things that would benefit everyone, not just the shareholders of these companies.
Right, it's like taking money from the public and giving it to those who already have plenty.
Okay, so privatization, subsidies, what's next on their list of predictions?
Well, they also suggest that there could be a shift away from universal health care coverage.
What do you mean?
So instead of aiming for a system where everyone has access to healthcare, regardless of their income or job status, they might push for a more market-based approach.
So it's like saying healthcare isn't a right, it's a commodity. If you can afford it, you can have it. If not, well, that's your problem.
It's a bit harsh, but that's the general idea. And it could lead to a situation where people with pre-existing conditions are priced out of the market, where those who work in low-wage jobs can't afford decent coverage, and where even a minor illness or injury could lead to financial ruin.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster. It's basically saying that your access to healthcare depends on how much money you have. And those who are already struggling are the ones who will suffer the most.
That's right. And it ties into this larger trend we've been talking about, the erosion of the social safety net, and the idea that everyone deserves a basic level of support and security.
Okay, so we've got privatization, subsidies, a move away from universal coverage. It's not exactly a rosy picture. What else?
Well, they also predict a push to eliminate regulations. Those rules that are designed to protect public health and safety.
Like what kind of regulations?
We're talking about things like environmental protections, food and drug safety standards, oversight of the medical industry, basically all those things that are meant to keep us safe and healthy.
And they're saying MAHA wants to get rid of those.
Well, not necessarily get rid of them entirely, but they might push to weaken them, to make it easier for companies to operate with less oversight.
And that's dangerous because...
Because it creates more opportunities for abuse. I mean, we've seen what can happen when companies are allowed to self-regulate. It often leads to corners being cut, safety being compromised, and ultimately, people getting hurt.
So it's like they're putting profits ahead of people's well-being, prioritizing short-term economic gain over long-term public health.
Right. And the article argues that the MAHA Commission could be a vehicle for this kind of deregulation agenda.
Okay, so far we've got privatization, corporate subsidies, a shift away from universal coverage, and deregulation. It's a pretty grim picture, honestly. But are there specific groups they mention as being particularly vulnerable under this potential system?
Yeah, they specifically highlight the potential impact on trans individuals and people with disabilities.
We talked about that a bit earlier, right? How they could be disproportionately affected by these changes.
Exactly. And the article digs a bit deeper into why they're particularly concerned. They point out that these groups already face significant barriers to accessing quality health care. And under a more privatized, market-driven system, those barriers could become even more difficult to overcome.
It's like taking a system that's already broken and making it even worse for those who are already struggling.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of discrimination. They worry that these groups could be targeted with harmful policies, especially if that protect the children rhetoric is used to justify restrictions on their rights and their access to care.
So it's not just about access to care, it's about their basic rights and their dignity as human beings.
Right. And the article is basically saying that we need to be very vigilant, very vocal in challenging these kinds of tactics and defending the rights of everyone to access quality health care, no matter who they are or what their circumstances are.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential consequences, and it's a lot to take in, honestly. It's kind of overwhelming, even a little bit scary. But what can we actually do about it? Where do we even start?
I get it. It's easy to feel overwhelmed. But remember, the point of this article isn't to make us feel hopeless. It's to empower us to act.
So what can we do?
Well, they offer a few suggestions. First and foremost, they stress the importance of education and awareness.
Okay, so the more people who understand what's happening, the better our chances of fighting back.
Exactly. It's about sharing this information with others, having these conversations, making sure people understand the stakes.
So education is key. What else can we do?
They also encourage people to support organizations that are doing the work on the ground, those groups that are fighting for social justice and economic equality.
So like those groups that advocate for universal health care, affordable housing, things like that.
Exactly. Those organizations are on the front lines of this fight, and they need our support.
Okay, what else?
Well, they also emphasize the importance of political engagement. So, contacting our elected officials, voting in elections, holding our leaders accountable.
So basically making our voices heard and demanding that our government represent the interests of the people, not just corporations and wealthy donors.
That's right. And it's not just about voting every few years. It's about staying engaged, staying informed, and building relationships with our elected officials so they know we're paying attention.
It sounds like a lot of work.
It is, but it's also about remembering that we're not alone in this. There are a lot of people and organizations out there fighting for a better world, and when we come together, we can make a real difference.
Well, that's a more hopeful note to end on.
All right, so we've talked about the tactics the MAHA Commission might use, But the article goes a step further, right?
Yeah, they don't just stop at the how. They actually try to predict what could happen if this commission gets its way.
Right, and it's not just speculation. They're looking at the commission's makeup, their stated goals, and these larger trends we've been talking about, like neoliberalism and all that.
So it's like they're connecting the dots and saying, okay, if this is the path they're on, here's where it could lead.
Exactly. And, spoiler alert, it's not a pretty picture.
All right, well, let's hear it. What's the first big prediction?
Well, they think the most likely outcome is a big shift towards privatization, basically taking public health resources and handing them over to private companies.
Okay, so less government involvement, more private company calling the shots. But what does that actually look like in real life?
Think about Medicaid, for example. Right now, it's a government-funded program, right? Millions of low-income Americans rely on it for health care.
Right.
Well, the article suggests that this commission could push to a privatized parts of Medicaid, hand it over to private insurance companies.
So instead of the government running things, you'd have these companies in charge with a profit motive built in.
Exactly. And that raises some serious questions about whether people would actually get the care they need. I mean, these companies, they're going to be focused on their bottom line. They'll be looking for ways to cut costs and maximize profits.
Yeah, and that could mean limiting services, denying coverage, all sorts of things that could put people's health at risk.
Exactly. It's like healthcare becomes just another product to be bought and sold.
And those who can't afford it, well, they're out of luck.
Right. And it's not just Medicaid they're worried about. The article suggests that other public health services could be targeted too. Things like school nutrition programs.
So basically, taking things that are currently considered public goods, things that benefit everyone, and turning them into opportunities for private companies to make money.
Right. It's part of this larger trend of shrinking the role of government and expanding the role of the private sector.
And is that always a bad thing? I mean, some people argue that businesses are more efficient than government agencies.
Sure, that's a common argument. But this article is pushing back on that, especially when it comes to essential services like healthcare. They're saying it's not that simple.
Why not?
Well, for one thing, healthcare is incredibly complex. You can't always compare different providers or treatments like you can with other products. And when people are thick, they're not always in a position to make the best decisions about their care.
Yeah, I get that. It's not like you're shopping for a new phone or something where you can easily compare features and prices. Healthcare is much more complicated than that.
Exactly. And then you add in the profit motive, and things get even more complicated. Companies are going to be looking for ways to cut costs and increase their revenue. And that can sometimes come at the expense of quality care.
So it's like this tension between the need to provide care and the need to make a profit, and those two things don't always align.
Right. And the article is basically saying that when it comes to something as essential as healthcare, we shouldn't be putting profit first. We need to prioritize people's well-being.
Okay, so privatization is one big prediction. What else do they say could happen?
Well, they also talk about the potential for increased corporate subsidies. Basically, the government giving money to these private healthcare companies.
Wait, so even though these companies are already profitable, the government would be giving them even more money?
That's right, and the article argues that these subsidies would be a huge waste of taxpayer money. Instead of investing in public programs that benefit everyone, we'd be propping up private companies that are already doing just fine on their own.
And that money could be used to fund things like universal health care, right? Programs that would actually make healthcare more affordable and accessible for everyone.
Exactly.
Okay, so privatization, corporate subsidies, what's next?
Well, they also predict a move away from the idea of universal healthcare coverage.
So instead of striving for a system where everyone has access to healthcare, regardless of their income or employment status.
Right, they might push for a system that's more market-driven, where healthcare is treated as a commodity, something you buy and sell like any other product.
And that could lead to a situation where people with pre-existing conditions are priced out of the market, where those who work in low-wage jobs can't afford coverage.
Exactly, and where even a minor illness or injury could lead to financial ruin. It's basically saying that your access to healthcare depends on how much money you have.
Okay, so we've got privatization, corporate subsidies, a shit away from universal healthcare. It's not looking good. Anything else?
Yeah, they also predict a push to roll back regulations, those rules that are designed to protect public health and safety.
Like environmental protections, food safety standards, things like that.
Exactly. The argument is often framed as cutting red tape and promoting innovation. But the reality is that deregulation often leads to companies cutting corners, putting profits ahead of people's well-being.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it happen in other industries. When companies are allowed to self-regulate, it doesn't always work out so well for the public.
Right. And the article is suggesting that the MAHA Commission could be used to advance this kind of deregulation agenda, even if it means putting people at risk.
Okay, so far we've got privatization, corporate subsidies, a move away from universal health care, and deregulation. It's a pretty bleak picture. Are there any specific groups they mention as being especially vulnerable in this scenario?
Yes, they specifically highlight trans individuals and people with disabilities. They point out that these groups already face a lot of barriers when it comes to accessing quality health care. And under a more privatized, market-driven system, those barriers could become even more difficult to overcome.
So it's like they're already facing an uphill battle, and this would make it even steeper.
Right, and there's also the concern about discrimination. They worry that these groups could be specifically targeted with policies that restrict their rights and access to care.
Especially if that protect the children rhetoric is used to justify those policies.
Exactly. It's a way to create fear and division, to pit people against each other and make it harder to build solidarity.
Okay, so this has been a pretty heavy conversation. It's a lot to process, and honestly, it's kind of scary to think about what could happen. But what can we do? I mean, is there any reason for hope?
Absolutely. I think the first step is just being aware of what's happening, understanding the potential consequences of these policies. That's why articles like this one are so important. They help us see the bigger picture and understand the forces that are shaping our world.
So education is key. What else can we do?
Well, we can also support the organizations that are fighting for a more just and equitable society. There are a lot of groups out there doing amazing work to advocate for policies that benefit everyone, not just the wealthy and powerful.
So finding those groups and supporting their work, whether it's through donations, volunteering, or just spreading the word about what they're doing.
Exactly. And we can also get involved in the political process, contact our elected officials, vote in elections, make our voices heard.
So it's not just about being informed, it's about taking action, using our voices and our votes to push for change.
Right. And it's about remembering that we're not alone in this. There are a lot of people who are working to create a better world. And when we come together, we can make a real difference.
Well, that's a good note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a lot to take in, but hopefully it's also been empowering. We've learned about some of the challenges we're facing, but we've also talked about some of the things we can do to fight back and create a more just and equitable world. So stay informed, stay engaged, and keep fighting the good fight.
Well, 2012 and a lot of the people know that I'm doing for the same generation who is over 2 long times your head and reaps are due, that I had the most real things that are all good and good you.